We continue with our series, 2 Samuel. We'll be discussing chapters 4 and 5. The title for our message for today is How the Lord Made David King of Israel. So you remember last time, we talked about Abner being killed by Joab, and David had the difficulty dealing with Joab, the commander of his army, because he murdered Abner, and it caused him trouble with the northern peoples. But he gave him an honorable burial, and he had to explain to the northern people that he had nothing to do with the murder of Abner. We asked last time, was David very impatient by the fact that he made an agreement with Abner, that Abner will take the power from Ishbosheth, the son of Shaul, to whom he gave control over the kingdom. But then we have learned that Abner was really the one who had the power there. And they made an agreement that he will turn over the kingdom from Ishbosheth to him, and David will be the king over all Israel. And since Abner was murdered by his own commander Joab, that did not push through. And the good thing about this is that David did not pursue to gain power from Ishbosheth, to have control over the kingdom of Israel. So it was the Lord who made David king over Israel. So that is the title of our message for today. Let me share you 3 lessons from chapters 4 and 5, which is our study for this evening. First of all, the Lord loves justice. So we'll be reading the whole chapter of chapter 4. David gives justice for Ishbosheth against his murderers. So for the second time, people came to David and proudly reported that they have killed a member of the royal family. First, it was an Amaleki guy. And thinking that it would please him and David would favor him, that was an Amaleki guy. So what happened in chapter 1, verse 13 to 15, David executed the guy for confessing to be the murderer of Shaul. So now in chapter 4, 2 Beerothis murdered Ishbosheth, the son of Shaul, in his sleep in his house. So let's see what happened in the story. So the first subpoint is, David served justice against the murderers of Mephibosheth. Verse 1, when Ishbosheth, son of Shaul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. So that's understandable because, again, Abner was the strongest man in the kingdom. He was actually the kingmaker, the commander, and he was the defender of the nation from any oppression. So the weak leader, Ishbosheth, lost a protector and defender who was Abner. So it is understandable that he would be very fearful alongside with all the tribes of Israel. This truly showed that Abner was the real powerful person in all of the northern part of Israel. And there was nobody as brave as him. And we know that Joab was the better guy. And soon, Joab will be the commander of the whole army of Israel. Verse 2, now Shaul had 2 men who were leaders of raiding bands. So that's how they used to extend their territories or take true control of the territories that God promised them to have. But of course, at that time, other tribes were in control of those lands. One was named Baana and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, the Beerothi from the tribe of Binyamin. Beeroth was considered part of Binyamin. Why? Verse 3, because the people of Beeroth fled to Gittayim, which is part of Binyamin, and have resided there as foreigners to this day. So what we can see here is the author is introducing to us 2 new characters into the story. And he's giving us the background of these guys. Beeroth were ancient city of the Hivis or Hivites, or in English, Hivites. So these were not Israelis, but they were integrated into the tribe of Binyamin because they sought refuge. So these non-Israelis, they were foreigners, were survivors, and were integrated into the tribe of Binyamin. Verse 4, Jehonathan, son of Shaul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Shaul and Jehonathan came from Yisrael. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. Why is Mephibosheth mentioned here? And you can see in our English translation, it is closed in parenthesis. Actually, Mephibosheth would be mentioned again in chapters 9 to 19 and 21. But he is introduced here to show that he was not fit for service for leadership because he was lame. Since the story is about the death of Ishbosheth, Mephibosheth could not take control over the land, being a survivor of the sons of Shaul. In this case, he was the grandson of Shaul. So who are the murderers of Mephibosheth? Verse 5, Now Rachav and Baana, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothi, set out for the house of Ishbosheth. And they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. So we have two evil men taking advantage of the weakness of the leadership of the northern Israel. Since Avner has died and no one is taking really his place, and there was a lack of security in the household of the royal family. So that's why they were able to enter the house of Ishbosheth. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat. They're pretending. And they stabbed him in the stomach. Oh, remember, Shaul tragically died alongside with Jehonathan and his two brothers. Avner was also murdered, and now this guy is also killed without any chance of fighting back. Rachav and his brother Baana slipped away. So the two men intentionally went to Ishbosheth pretentiously to get some wheat, but we know since they were foreigners, they were not in good terms really with the Binyamin. They had to just come under their wings, but then they were actually enemies. So they looked for Ishbosheth intentionally, and when they saw him off guard because he was sleeping, they murdered him. So the two Beerothis took advantage of the lack of security of the king. So sad. So this is a tragedy. Now, think of it. Why did they have to murder Ishbosheth? What did Ishbosheth do? Maybe he didn't do anything wrong with the Beerothis, but maybe because the Israelis were the ones who captured these lands, the Canaanite land, and one of them were the Hivites. So they lost to the Israelites during the Israeli conquest. Maybe because they were very angry at how the weak kingdom had become. That's one possibility. They wanted change in leadership. They did not intend actually to take control over the kingdom. Why? Because later on we'll find out that they didn't really try to take control of the kingdom. Their next move will tell us in the next few verses. So that was why they killed him. It was a cheap shot because Ishbosheth died in his sleep. He was very defenseless. Even though at the end of verse 6, it says there that the two brothers already slipped away, but the story really wasn't that complete. So the author had to expand on what really happened during that time when he was being murdered. So the two men were brutal murderers. Ishbosheth had no fighting chance. So as the author expands this in verse 7, let's read, they had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. He was able to get there. After they stabbed him and killed him, so they stabbed him in the stomach, eventually killing him, they took off his head. So it was not just about stabbing him to death and then leaving the place. They cut off his head, taking it with them. They traveled all night by the way of Arava. So not content with just stabbing Ishbosheth to death, they cut off and took his head. And eventually we'll find out that they brought his head to David. They brought the head as evidence that really they killed Ishbosheth. They had to keep going before they could be apprehended. So they left immediately there, even at night, traveling just to get to David. And they took the unusual road to Arava, which is the desert, so that they could actually escape. Nobody would try to chase them there. So they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Shaul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Shaul and his offspring." So they were rushing toward David, thinking that David would be pleased with the good news that the king of the north of Israel was dead. Now, this is actually a tragedy. I want us to really imagine how painful this event was. Imagine when they discovered, the people around Ishbosheth, his family, his servants, and the whole of Israel, when they learned about the news that Ishbosheth is dead, Avner is dead, Ishbosheth is dead, they are susceptible to their enemies. There's no one among them who could bring them together, who would be leading them. So this is a tragedy. And the story of the household of Shaul is one tragedy after another. You understand that? This is just sad. God placed Shaul before there, and because of his disobedience to the Lord, he had to be dethroned, and all of a sudden, things just fell apart from them. One tragedy after the other. And the tragedy of the house of Shaul was the tragedy of the whole 10 tribes of the north. So imagine also what the southern people, the southern Israelis, the Yehudis, felt a bad successive events that were happening. And they kept getting involved in this because the people who murdered Shaul and now Ishbosheth were always going to David. Abner got killed in Hebron. So not only that they have to explain that they had nothing to do with the death of Shaul, of Abner, and with Ishbosheth, but they were not trying to steal the kingdom away from Shaul's family. Again, we said David had to be patient for God to give him control over the northern territories. Maybe these Beerothi people, these guys, were wondering why David did not take advantage of the weak leader like Ishbosheth. With the death of Abner, and with Mephibosheth as a lame person who could not take charge of the nation. Now, maybe that's one of the reasons why the Beerothis went to David. Maybe this is the time for us to help David become the king. Now, David must be very surprised at seeing this news. He was surprised to learn that Shaul was dead after becoming a big hero when he was able to save his people from the Philistines. And then Abner, he was happy that he could work with him and have the kingdom. And then everything turned bad. Now, Ishbosheth is dead. Everything is just going wrong. And these two guys is presenting the head to him as a present. What an awful sight. What's going on here? We want to have good news about their nation, but everything is going so bad. Now, the Beerothi said, Shaul, your enemy who tried to kill you. Now, it's true that Shaul tried to kill David, but David never considered Shaul as his enemies. David kept on calling him as his master, as his Lord. He respected the king, his father-in-law. So Shaul is not the enemy of David as far as David is concerned. So again, he even invoked the name of the Lord. This day the Lord has avenged my Lord, the king, against Shaul and his offspring. So they're changing allegiance from the north to the south. So they thought that David wanted revenge against the house of Shaul, especially that they included the son, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth had no offense against David. Ishbosheth didn't try to kill David after all. He was placed on the throne by Abner because, he's the son and people were relying on him. You can see that Ishbosheth had to pay for the sins of his father. So why murder Ishbosheth when it was Shaul who was chasing David and trying to kill him? So this really displeased David. So the self-confession of the men exposed themselves and they tried to avenge for David, certainly. Verse 9, David answered Rechab and his brother Baana, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothi, as surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble. When someone told me Shaul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Should I not now demand his blood from you, your hand, and rid the earth of you? So David was really upset at what was going on. When he saw, I believe, the head of Ishbosheth, I think David was brokenhearted. It was mixed feelings because this is not supposed to happen. He wasn't wishing Ishbosheth failure in his kingship. This is his brother-in-law. So he was really broken at the death of Ishbosheth. This was tragedy. This was not victory for the Lord and for David. Losing Abner was terribly wrong. Losing Ishbosheth was more horrific. The northern kingdom had become weaker and they had no leader. So David, in judging the two Beerothis, he invoked the name of the Lord because he was the authority, as surely as the Lord lives. As much as the two guys in the previous verse said, this day the Lord has avenged my Lord. They're using the name of the Lord. Now David is saying, as surely as the Lord lives. David invoked the name of the Lord, being the authority, and before condemning the two, he had to provide a basis for his upcoming judgment against these two people in order to show consistency. So he said, when the guy, the Amaleki, brought the news to him that Shaul is dead and he claimed to have killed Shaul, the reward I gave him for his news was to put him to death. And he cited what he did to that Amaleki guy. Now, he had to execute as well, for consistency and for justice sake, these two men who claimed to have killed Ishbosheth and was actually bringing the head of Ishbosheth there. So, as David exclaims that this case was worse than the first one. Because eventually we have learned that the Amalekite guy didn't really kill Shaul. He was lying. He was just trying to impress David and to gain his favor. Now these two guys have the head of Ishbosheth. Judgment should be no less than what he imposed against that Amalekite guy. The Beerothis deserved capital punishment. Now I demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you. You don't deserve to live on earth. So imagine at the surprise of the Beerothis. They thought that that was the best day of their lives, that they can help out David and maybe they can gain some position when David rises to the throne. No, that's not what they got. So our second point is David gave Ishbosheth an honorable burial. Verse 12, so David got an order to his men and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool of Hebron. So it was not just enough to execute the men in a simple way. They had to be dismembered to show which parts of their body committed the crime. Their bodies were displayed for everybody to see in Hebron so that the people will fear that you don't commit such crimes, especially against our northern counterparts, their leadership. The justice was swift and serious. You see, David could not afford to arrest Joab before, so he had just to make a lament. But here he could not let this go. He could not let this pass by. So since David had only the head of Ishbosheth, so he buried him. That verse continues. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Avner's tomb at Hebron. So since David had only the head of Ishbosheth, they buried it in respect to the deceased king, because they could not do that thing to the body. They placed it in Avner's remains for all Yehudis to see and to pay respect to both of them, the leaders of the northern Israel. So it's a wonder, no, that this thing happened, that both of these two great men from Israel were buried in Hebron, in the south. So imagine if the northern people would want to retrieve the bodies, or at least they had the body of Ishbosheth, at least the head and the body of Avner. They couldn't because it is buried in Hebron. But David was swift in executing justice. As we have said, the Lord loves justice. Swift justice is sweet justice. You know, delayed justice, as people say, is no justice at all. Right? So the Lord loves justice. David served justice against the murderers of Ishbosheth. He executed them, and David gave Ishbosheth an honorable burial. But here is the bottom line of the story. Aside from that, the Lord loves justice, and David executed quick justice for Ishbosheth. Number one, David had nothing to do with the death of Ishbosheth because it happened there, not in Hebron. And the guys just brought his head. He did not know the murderers prior to the execution of Ishbosheth, the murder of Ishbosheth. He only got to know them when they arrived in Hebron and brought the head of Ishbosheth. Therefore, they could not have been the agents of David. He did not send his Beerothis to kill Ishbosheth. He immediately judged and executed justice against them for murdering Ishbosheth. It's a sign to the northern people. As soon as I learned about what they did to your king, I executed them and provided justice for all of you. Letter B, the Lord establishes and strengthens. So we discussed the first half of chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. David finally has been accepted in the northern Israel. He gets closer to Gibeah of Benjamin by conquering Jerusalem or Jerusalem of the Yeshuvis or the Jebusites and making it his city. So upon the death of Abner in chapter 3, David did not make any advances against Ishbosheth. So remember, we learned last time, David reigned in Yehuda 7.5 years. Ishbosheth only 2. So what happened between the 5.5 years? Israel had no king at that time. David had been waiting for God to establish him as the king even of the north. Because when he tried to make a deal with Abner, it didn't work. He had to rely on God to make him, to establish him as the king of the northern territories as well. So he did not make any advances against Ishbosheth, and even after his death, especially when he was reigning to overtake his kingdom. He did not take advantage of the weakness of the leadership in northern Israel. So our first point is, the Lord brought the northern Israelis under David's wings. So this is God facilitating the transfer of leadership of the northern territories to David. Chapter 5, verse 1. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your flesh and blood. In the past, while Shaul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." That's in chapter 13, verse 1 of 1 Samuel. So the author did not discuss anymore any reaction from the northern tribes about the death of Ishbosheth. That's not important at that time. They did not have to suspect David of getting involved in his death. They understood that it was the Beerothis who did this. They had an agenda against the Israelis. Now, you will see there in verse 1, all tribes. This probably represented by the elders of the 10 tribes of the north. They probably the ones that went to David. They were unanimous in their decision to come to Hebron. But they did not have to fear David. They came there knowing that David loved them as well. David never threatened them. David welcomed them. They acknowledged, the leaders of the 10 tribes, David's past contribution. You will see there. In the past, you led our military campaigns. That was very important. David's contribution has been recognized. And his good track record during the reign of King Shaul. When they said, "We are your flesh and blood," the Israelis claimed their essential connection to David. We're not unrelated with you. You have been our leader before, right? Imagine how touched David was at these words of the northern Israelis. He did not have to explain what happened in the past. They were the ones really acknowledging who he was. He had not seen them for a long time. And maybe he thought that he owed them an explanation of what really happened with Avner and all of them, even though he has sent messages before to them to explain everything to them. He was just concerned for these people. So he accepted them. He loved them. So now that they have acknowledged that they were truly related with each other, I believe David was really touched. So as the people acknowledged David's leadership before he ran away from Shaul, who was trying to kill him, he really fought for every one of them. So this meeting was, I think, a very pleasing moment for both the northern people and the southern people. They can be one again. They're talking again. They can see that they're not separating from each other, that they are one. Now, everything was coming smoothly for David. And perhaps he must be praising God. God, thank you that these elders of the north are coming to me and they're expressing their love for me. They want me to be their leader. So I could imagine he must be embracing them. Hey, I missed you. Hey, I know you. Remember that? Yes, we are just one people. We all belong to Yahweh, our God. And I remember when we were fighting on the same side. So this was a very glorious moment for every one of them. And it's a good thing that the initiative of the northern people to come to David really helped them come together. Because it was difficult for David. He was shy, of course. Because any move that he made might be construed as trying to grab some power or influence over them. So the northern Israelis appealed to the word of God. Look at the last part of verse 2. The Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people and you will become their ruler. So that's the reason why they're coming to him. It's God himself who promised this. And we have to acknowledge God's plan for you, David, and for us. Verse 3. When all the elders of Israel had come to David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Woo! That was very good. The northern people, instead of asking for a meeting with David, instead of asking to meet somewhere in between, not in Hebron because that's your territory and maybe we're not secure there. No. Instead of asking for a neutral place, they confidently went there, knowing David was a kind guy. They approached him. David did not invite the people to come to his wings, especially upon the death of Ishbosheth. The people did the right thing. So maybe it took them 5.5 years to realize we need David. That long. So this must be a very humbling and pleasant and delightful moment for David being anointed as king. Finally, he was anointed by Samuel when he was young, and right now, people really acknowledge him as their head of state. It was a very peaceful, unifying, and securing moment for all of Israel, both for the north and for the south. Finally, they were one. They were one. So, the cutting of the covenant probably meant they offered sacrifices. It took place in Hebron, very important because this is the city that God told David to reign. So, the people must come to God, this time in Hebron. The kingship of David came to him. He did not pursue for the kingship. He tried with Avner. He failed. But when God gave it to him, everything went so smoothly, peacefully, and joyously. The Lord facilitated this transfer power to David. Everything was well. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Yehuda 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Yehuda 33 years. So that makes 40. So the author is summarizing the length of the reign of David here. So to reign for 40 years, it means complete term. He completed his term as king. That's the minimal. That's about a generation of people. The author also had to note that his reign in Yehuda was counted 7.5 years in his total reign as the king of both north and south. Addition to that, he was a legitimate king when he was ruling in Yehuda. So that made up the 40 years. So that early part is legitimate. He was truly reigning as king. So David reigned 40 years, long enough to complete a term. Number 2, the Lord gave Jerusalem to be David's city. Verse 6, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Yeshuvis or the Jebusites who live there. Now, think of it. What have the Yeshuvis done? Why did David attack them? It's like this. Taking control of Jerusalem or Jerusalem, this was believed to be where Abraham offered Yitzhak, Mount Moriah. Anyway, it's not mentioned here. It's just what the people believe. It was a strategic place for David to rule from. He needed to get nearer to the royal house. Remember, Hebron is in the middle of Yehuda. Gibeon, which is in Benjamin, was in the north. He wanted to get closer there, at least by the edge of Yehuda, so he can get closer to the north, so that the northern people would feel that he was their king. All right? So Gibeon is part of Benjamin. Now, Ishbosheth did not rule from Gibeon. He went to East Manasseh on the eastern side of Jordan for security purposes, and so that he can reach more the other tribes of the north. So instead of taking control of Machanaim or taking control of Gibeon, where Shaul reigned, he decided Jerusalem is the better place to rule. Now, Gibeon is north of Jerusalem for about 10.46 kilometers. So that's not very far. But it's still part of Benjamin. Now, actually, the Israelis were supposed to dispossess the Jebusites or Yeshuvis of Jerusalem. But somehow they failed to do that. Somehow the Yeshuvis were able to gain back the control of Jerusalem. How? If we'll go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 8, God promised the whole of Canaan, including Jerusalem, which was under the control of Yeshuvis. So we have the Canaanites, Hittites, Amoris, Perizis, Hivis, and Yeshuvis. They were controlling Jerusalem. Okay? So the Lord promised to give Israel Jerusalem of the territory of the Yeshuvis. Another reference from Joshua chapter 12, verse 7, when Joshua led the campaign to take control of Canaan, he was able to largely take control of the whole place. And it says there in verse 8, these were the kings that Yehoshua conquered. The king of Jerusalem, one king. The king of Hebron, one king. And then the list goes on. Okay? So they had overall control of the place. So somehow the Yeshuvis are trapped within their territories. But they had to really take control of it. So 3 chapters after that, chapter 15, verse 63 says, Yehuda could not dislodge the Yeshuvis who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Yeshuvis live there with the people of Yehuda. So, Yehuda should be controlling Jerusalem. But then, because they failed, the people of Benjamin tried to take control of Jerusalem. So that's why it could be said that Jerusalem was part of Benjamin. The people of Benjamin, however, did not drive out the Yeshuvis after taking control of it, who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Yeshuvis live there with the people of Benjamin. So, verse 6, The Yeshuvis said to David, "You will not get in there. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought David cannot get in there because they have made Jerusalem so strong a fortress that the Yehudis failed, the Benjamin failed to take control of it. Who is David to control this, to take charge of it? David cannot even win over our weakest people, the blind and the lame. So they were insulting David. Verse 7, nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, or Zion, which is the city of David. So probably Zion is the name that the Yeshuvis used for that place. And it was called Jerusalem by the Hebrews or by the Israelis. So taking control of Jerusalem was continuing the mandate to control the land. They failed before. David finally was able to complete the mandate that God has given them. Take control of this land. Remember the mandate of God to Israel, which Shaul failed. You should have destroyed the Amalekites, and he did not. And so God was so upset with him. So it's very important for the kings to complete the job that God has given them. Jerusalem, again, was part of Yehuda and then of Benjamin, and now it has become part of both because, remember, David was a Yehudi and he was also legally of Benjamin because he's the son-in-law of Shaul. So it was a very good place. It's both part of Yehuda and part of Benjamin, so he can actually rule from that. So the Yeshuvis insulted and underestimated David's attempt to conquer Jerusalem. But they didn't realize that it was the moment that God would be giving the city to David. So David successfully captured Zion. So the Yeshuvis thought that David would never be able to conquer their city, Zion. Did David get rid of everyone in Zion? No, actually. If we look at the last part of this 2 Samuel, chapter 24, verse 18, there was still a Yeshuvi there. In fact, when he made the census and God was upset with him and God sent a plague, and when he pled, "Lord, please let the plague stop," the angel of the Lord stopped at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Yeshuvi. And because it stopped there, okay, even though that's the city of David, there was still a Yeshuvi owning a land inside that city. The king said, "I want to buy your land." Eventually, that place became the place where the future tabernacle, future temple was built by his son Shlomo. And this is the controversial place right now in Jerusalem where the Muslims and the Israelis trying to get control of. So you see there the Dome of the Rock. You see there just near it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque and then the Wailing Wall. So that was the place that the Yeshuvi owned, Araunah. So even though David had control of Jerusalem, he paid for the lot of Araunah, the Yebusi, a survivor of David's conquest of the city. Let's go back to chapter 5, verse 8. On that day, David had said, "Anyone who conquers the Yeshuvis will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the palace. So as the Yeshuvis were insulting David for his inability to conquer their land or their city, now David reverses the insult to them. Obviously, nobody could reach that place through a water shaft, which is a subterranean, under the ground waterway. Right now, it's called Warren's Shaft because of the guy who discovered that shaft, Warren. The point is, if the blind and lame could not enter the palace, how much more a regular Yeshuvi? They are prohibited from entering the city of David. So as David disproved the Yeshuvis wrong, he reverted their insult back to them. Verse 9, David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward. And he became more and more powerful because the Lord God of armies, or in Hebrew, Yahweh Elohe Shabaot. You've heard of people saying Sabaot. This is the word. And God was with him. So David, as a wise leader, prioritized securing the place and establishing the palace and remaining it to his name, City of David. Because the Israelis needed to see that David was organized and he is a good leader. So if he is able to secure his own place, then the people of Israel will also feel secured about their whole nation. But the author gives us a theological interpretation or explanation about all the good things that has happened for David and for the people of Israel. In verse 10, he became more and more powerful that when the leader improves, everybody wins. right? So in this case, it was the Lord, the God of the armies. The Lord was with him. So God was the reason why David became stronger. So the title Yahweh, God of armies, actually first appeared in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And that was in Shiloh, part of Ephraim, because the tabernacle was kept there. And Eli, remember that? He was the mentor of Samuel. He was ruling from there. He was doing spiritual service in Shiloh. In our next lesson, they will take the tabernacle to Jerusalem. So it was the power and the presence of God that every leader needs. The power and the presence of God were the keys to David's success. So if we want to be as successful as believers in fulfilling our commission from the Lord to make disciples, we have to trust and we have to be empowered by God. Number 3, the Lord provided a palace for David's establishment. Now Hiram, king of Zor or Tyre, which is part of Lebanon, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Imagine this, foreigners were acknowledging David and they were making his palace. They were doing all the effort for David. Wow, that's really a blessing. So it's like somebody built your house for you. You didn't spend for it. You didn't do anything. You let them do it for you. What a great blessing. So the Lord blessed David with the supply and with the help of the Phoenicians, this Hiram, king of Zor. They acknowledge his new government. You know, when somebody wins in a revolution, other nations will have to acknowledge or not. In our case, when Cory Aquino became the president, quickly all the nations acknowledged she's the new president. If you don't get the recognition of other nations, you'll have a hard time dealing with them, especially the powerful nations. So David had a peaceful relationship with them. Their neighbor, these are their neighbors, adjacent neighbors. David's rule was for the beneficiaries, Israel. You see that in verse 12, David knew that the Lord had established him. In other translations, David realized, wow, it's all becoming true. Now I realize, now I know, because everything was falling into place for me. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. It's all about Israel. It's not about David. But when David grows and becomes stronger, everybody wins. So it's very important for leaders to be established in the Lord. When one seeks to establish his own name and rule, it can fail and fall. But when God establishes a leader, a king, the kingdom will be exalted and God will be honored. So when everything came to David, he realized that this was all God's work upon his life for the benefit of Israel. It's a wonderful story. Number 4, the Lord allowed the increase of David's family. Verse 13, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These were the names of the children born to him there. This is a challenge, reading foreign names. Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Shelomo. This is Solomon. And we know who his mother was, Bathsheba. But at this time, he didn't know Bathsheba yet. So the author is just summarizing, enumerating the list of all the sons David had in Jerusalem. Yivchar, Elishua, Nepheg, Yafia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. In addition to David's 6 sons from 6 wives, David had 12 more sons and perhaps daughters, and they were not just mentioned. Their mothers, either wives or concubines, were not named anymore. Now, having many sons was considered a great blessing from the Lord. Now, again, we discussed this before. The Lord tolerated David having so many wives and concubines, but he'd soon pay for this. So some of the additional wives and concubines of David were probably treaty wives. You know, I explained to you treaty wives. These are the daughters of foreign kings. They offer their daughters to the new king so they can be related and have sons so they have peace. They won't fight each other. Treaty wives. Okay? The Lord establishes and strengthens. The Lord brought the northern Israelites under David's wings. The Lord gave Jerusalem to be David's city. The Lord provided a palace for David's establishment, and the Lord allowed the increase of David's family. How the Lord made David king of Israel. The Lord loves justice, and David executed justice for Ishbosheth. The Lord establishes and strengthens, David finally became the king of Israel.